with beginnings, doesn't matter what we believe it by faith. Because we cannot go back and look at and test and experiment and observe beginnings. They're outside of our ability to do so. But by smoke and mirrors, evolutionists would have you believe otherwise. They would have you believe that their view of beginnings, of origins, is science. And it's not so, because we're dealing with history. We're dealing with something that occurred in the past. And therefore, by its very nature, it cannot be repeated, can't be observed. And as Christians, we believe in the Word of God. So as we come to the world in which we live, and see things like mountains and fossils and canyons and valleys and cells and all of these sorts of things that originated in the past, we look at them through an assumption that the Bible is true, and that is how we should look at them. And we need not be fearful that that is somehow unscientific, because it's just not so. Evolutionists, those that believe in the Big Bang and evolution, they also come to the evidence with assumptions about the past. Firstly, the primary assumption that drives the Big Bang and evolution is that God had nothing to do with origins. He had nothing to do with beginnings. And they have to explain everything by purely natural causes. And we looked at this quote by Richard Lewontin. We have a prior commitment to materialism. And so we come up with all sorts of stories that often don't make sense. And they're unsubstantiated, just so stories, because we've got this commitment that God isn't allowed. And so as we interpret the evidence, we've got to tell a story without God. And I cannot express enough how important this difference is between the experimental science that gives us these laptops and cell phones and things that we're looking at now, which is based upon repeatable, experimental, observational science that can be done by Christian scientists or atheist scientists, and they'll observe and get the same results. And this type of science, and let's call it that, but it's really history. It's looking at the evidence and trying to come up with a story that accounts for how we got here. And where a Christian begins with the belief in a supernatural creator God, the vast majority of scientists today look at the evidence and begin with the assumption that there is no God, and we have to come up with a naturalistic explanation of how everything got here, because there's only two choices: either God created the heavens and the earth, or somehow they made themselves. Although there is increasingly another belief, and maybe we can mention that just now. And again, to illustrate this difference, we again and again we hear 14 billion years ago there was this singularity that exploded, and that explosion of the Big Bang somehow resulted in the incredible cosmos in which we live today. And we're told that that's science. Our kids and grandchildren are continually taught this is science. This is how we got here. a number of years ago, I think it was about 30 or 40 scientists. They're not Christians, but they wrote an open letter to the New Scientist journal. It's a peer-reviewed scientific journal, one of your top journals. And they called it Bucking the Big Bang. And they said things like this: the Big Bang today relies on a growing number of hypothetical entities, things that we have never observed. Inflation, dark matter, and dark energy are the most prominent examples. Without them, there would be a fatal contradiction between the observations made by astronomers and the predictions of the Big Bang theory. So what are they saying here? They're saying that in order for the Big Bang physics to work, inflation, dark matter, dark energy are some of the things that have to be real, have to exist in order for the Big Bang to work. But we've got no idea whether they actually exist or not, because they've never been observed. They've never been tested. They're called dark because we've never seen them. Dark energy, dark matter. And we hear about these things all the time. Billions and billions and billions of euros and dollars are spent every year on different experiments to try and detect these entities. And so believers in the Big Bang believe by faith in the Big Bang, and they believe by faith that inflation, dark matter, and dark energy, and there are other untestable components that need to exist in order for the Big Bang to work. So let's dispel this idea that a belief in biblical creation is faith. A belief in the Big Bang and evolution is science. Let's get rid of that, okay? The Big Bang and evolutionary origins is every bit faith. In fact, it takes far more faith, because the idea that something comes from nothing, which is what the Big Bang believes, is the most unscientific belief that you can imagine. Or that that matter somehow organizes itself by random processes into molecular information system of life, DNA, RNA. That is, it goes against everything that real science tells us. And so although a belief in creation is faith, real evidence supports that faith. Yeah, as scientists look at the information molecule of life, when left to random processes, it falls apart. It's subject to entropy, to disintegration. And over decades and decades of observing DNA and the genome of life, there are no examples that scientists can give of new novel information coming about in the DNA through random processes. All they see is either a conservation of information or a loss of information, sometimes a duplication of information. But a duplication is not new information, which is required for evolution to occur. And so the idea that life arose by random processes is an incredibly unscientific belief system. It's an unscientific faith. Real science doesn't support that faith. So I shared this quote with you from the Christian organization Biologos. It was begun by Francis Collins. He headed up the recent Operation Trump's vaccine operation. What is it called? Anyway, had a name, the vaccine program. Francis Collins headed that up. Great, he's a very accomplished scientist. But Biologos believes in theistic evolution, that somehow long ago God started some kind of process way back in the distance, billions of years ago, and from there random natural processes completed the job of creation of the universe and the creation of life. And one of their writers, Sparks, he said this: if Jesus as a finite human being erred from time to time, so the question is, why does he believe that Jesus erred from time to time, that Jesus got it wrong? Why does he believe that? Well, the reason is because Jesus said things like this. That on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel. So Jesus believed in a historical individual by the name of Abel, who lived a few thousand years ago, according to the Bible. But the whole history of Adam and Eve is, if evolution is true, as Biologos believes, then the whole history of Adam and Eve is a myth. Francis Collins has said, the idea of Adam and Eve as real historical characters, that's just a myth. We can't believe it. It's just telling us some kind of spiritual parable. Biologos believes that we evolved from a group of a few thousand ape-like ancestors over hundreds of thousands of years. So if Jesus believed in a historical Abel, one of the firstborn children of Adam and Eve, he was wrong. All right? Finite. He got it wrong. He was limited. He didn't know really what he was talking about because he didn't have the science of today. Jesus also said, in talking about the days leading up to his future coming, do we believe that Jesus is going to literally come again? Absolutely. Amen. And Jesus said, in the lead up to that time of my return, it will be as the days of Noah were. So if Jesus is literally going to come again, as we absolutely wholeheartedly believe, then in history, in real time in history, surely he can't be just making some kind of spiritual allusion to Noah. Jesus believed in a real historical Noah and the account given to us, and a very rebellious, ungodly world in the lead up to the judgment of Noah's day. Jesus believed in a historical Noah. Biologos believed, therefore, he got it wrong. He was ignorant. There was no global flood. There was no ark. We know better than that today. The fossil record and the geological column is a record of hundreds of millions of years. The account of Noah and the judgment flood, it never happened. Jesus got it wrong. When Jesus taught on marriage, he said, from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. Quoting directly there from Genesis 1, verse 27. And then he goes on to quote from Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they two shall become one flesh. And then Jesus added the rest there. what are the conclusions, or what is the logical conclusion of the fact that God created them male and female. But Jesus said from the beginning of the creation. So he believed that God created Adam and Eve, the first man and woman, the first husband and wife, right back at the beginning of the creation. If somebody believes in evolution, you cannot say that. You can only say, you've got to then say that, well, man and woman, husband and wife, that's a quaint tradition that came about after hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Came about billions of years after the Big Bang. It didn't begin at the beginning of the creation. Jesus, therefore, got it wrong. He didn't have the benefit of today's wonderful science that proves the Big Bang and biological evolution and all the rest of it. And so that is the basis of Biologos saying Jesus got it wrong from time to time. And that is the basis of the kenotic heresy. And it is a heresy. The idea that Jesus lost his divinity, or he gave up his divinity when he came to earth. And that idea, not surprisingly, arose in the mid-19th century. And it was a part of the whole development of the so-called Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, now wonderful science had been taking place since, the mid-1500s into the 1600s, 1700s. Amazing science within a Christian worldview, a Christian belief system. But in the 18th century, the so-called Enlightenment began, where scientists said, no, we cannot accept any other authority besides our own science, the things that we can scientifically prove. We reject a supernatural revelation. There is no authority outside of what science reveals. And that was the beginning of the project. Well, it actually wasn't the beginning, but the project to try and explain the universe without resorting to the supernatural came from the Enlightenment. And Darwin, and before him his friend Charles Lyell, were very much products of that Enlightenment thinking. We reject all authority other than our own science, our own observations. And it totally grew too big for its boots. Just the one reason I say that is because the scientific method cannot reach into the past. The scientific method of observation and experiment cannot reach into the distant past. We can't even do an experiment in the present to prove that the Second World War happened and when it happened and how it happened. You can't do an experiment to prove history. We know about those things based upon eyewitness accounts. That's how we do history. And if we don't have eyewitness accounts of things that happened in the past, then we have to resort to storytelling, to interpretation based upon our assumptions. So this idea, and this idea of Jesus having lost or given up his divinity, given up his knowledge of creation, began in the mid-19th century, along with these speculations on evolution and all the rest of it. And it was basically saying, we know better, therefore Jesus got it wrong, therefore he couldn't have been divine. He must have just been subject to the belief system and knowledge, scientific knowledge of his day, or knowledge of his day about things. And that's where it all began. And biologos today continue with that idea that he was just a finite human being constrained by the ignorance and lack of knowledge of his day. Well, that's not the Jesus that I know. The great I am, who before Abram's day was I am, Yahweh. Jesus put aside the benefits, the prerogative of his divinity at times, but he never lost his divinity. He never gave it up. He was and is always the eternal Son of God. And so the idea that he was misguided when it came to creation, and his belief in the flood of Noah, and that God created man and woman, husband and wife from the beginning of the creation, is just heresy. That's all it is. And I don't care who says it. And they give far too much credit to the speculations of science about origins. And these are incredibly important. This is very important for us as Christians to grapple with. Jesus said, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rise from the dead. So what's he talking about there? Well, Moses and the prophets. Moses, the writer of the first 5 books of the Bible, including Genesis. And so Jesus is saying, if they don't hear what Moses wrote, as well as the other prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rise from the dead. That's a very challenging statement. And I don't know its full implications, but I certainly do know that we need to take Moses and his writings extremely seriously. And this idea that Jesus lost his divinity and therefore he didn't know the truth about origins and about history, and he only revealed. So let's, even if we were to concede that, which I don't even remotely concede, but even if we were to concede that, Jesus made this statement, and I know that his command is everlasting life. Therefore, whatever I speak, just as the Father has told me, so I speak. So if Jesus had lost his divinity or put aside his divinity, he's still saying, whatever I speak what the Father has told me. That would mean that when he spoke about Abel and Noah and the beginning of marriage, the beginning of creation, that would mean that God got it wrong. That God also doesn't know, that he's a bit ignorant about origins, about creation. And of course, that's nonsense. It's not that Jesus gave up his divinity. It's not that he gave up his knowledge of creation, but he submitted himself to the will and revelation of God, his eternal Father. And he was on earth, took upon him the form of a man, in order to completely and absolutely fulfill his Heavenly Father's will. And therefore, it's not that he lacked knowledge or divinity, but he spoke what he was sent to speak, and he did what he was sent to do. So just some more thoughts there on the importance of this subject and our belief in Jesus Christ and who he is and what he's done. And why beginnings, origins is tremendously, tremendously important. So I'm going to wrap it up there, and just maybe if you guys want to unmute, if you got any questions or comments, and we can also take some time in prayer just now. Next time we speak on this, I'll look at some of the claims made about Jesus. So that Kenosan hypothesis, it went on to say this, that Jesus got it wrong, and therefore it's a logical conclusion that Moses and Paul and John also got many things wrong. And they were just writing from their own finite, broken horizons. In other words, the Bible is not inspired. And that is the subject of this piece that was written by this guy Sparks, After Inerrancy, he calls it. Evangelicals and the Bible in the postmodern age. We no longer can believe that the Bible is true. Some of it may be true, but we can't believe that it's inerrant. And so we'll look at some of the things that Paul and Peter wrote next time we meet on this subject, and think of the implications for our belief in Christ if evolution is true.
Mark, just a question for myself, and I don't think I think there is an answer, but when these guys come up with the theories and about evolution, and do you think their motive at the beginning was to try and reconcile science with the Bible and the biblical references to creation and that? Or do you think there was a strategy to try and instill doubt? As you just mentioned, Jesus got it wrong. The moment you start believing something like that, then the whole pack of cards collapses. The whole belief in the Bible, it festers a complete disbelief of one's faith. And whether there was this like a more sinister assumption or intention at the start of these theories that are created. So
no, Rob, question, very good, very good observation and question. And the modern Western science began, as I said earlier, within a Christian framework, within a Christian worldview. I think it was Johannes Kepler who, amongst many other things, he developed the model of planetary motion and that kind of thing. I think it was him. He said, "We think God's thoughts after him." And there are philosophers of science today that recognize that it wasn't just a coincidence that modern Western science began in a Christian worldview. It was because there was a Christian worldview that modern science began. Because those early scientists, their Christian belief system led them to believe that there is a creator God. Therefore, we live in an orderly designed universe. It may be fallen. There's things that have gone wrong. There's things that are broken, but it is a universe of order and law, because an all-knowing, all-powerful God planned it and created it. And therefore, if as scientists, we can look into the things in the universe and we will find laws and uniformity. And so that was the worldview framework in which science began. But then your Enlightenment scientists very, very deliberately wanted to get away from God. Guys like Charles Lyell, and really the whole history of deep time and billions of years primarily goes to somebody like him, but before him, James Hutton, another Scot. They were both Scotsmen. Charles Lyell was also a Scot. And they had to be careful because they still lived in a very Christian world. And so they had to be careful about revealing their motives. But it's in private correspondence that you pick up what their motives were. And Lyell said things like that his goal was to remove the science of geology from Moses. So he was very, very explicit about it. He rejected the Bible, rejected the writings of Moses, and therefore he had to reinterpret the rock layers and come up with a different account, because up until his time, there were many geologists that saw the sedimentary rock layers as a confirmation of the biblical flood. Sedimentary rocks laid down by water, and is a wonderful confirmation of the biblical account of the flood. The fossils in those rock layers, an unbelievable, incredible confirmation of what we read in the Bible, this incredible judgment that wiped out land-living, air-breathing animals on Earth, would have also wiped out much of the sea life in the oceans, and in the right conditions would have formed billions and billions of fossils, which is what we see as the fountains of the great deep broke up, and so on. And so Charles Lyell was quite upfront in private letters that was his motive. Darwin called Christianity something like an abominable belief system. He said, if it's true, then his father and some of his closest friends are in hell. And he rejected Christianity. There were also other influences in his life. He lost his 10-year-old daughter. Annie died from illness, and he was, as you can imagine, absolutely devastated by that. And as is often then brought up, how can a loving God allow that? And well, the Bible, without downplaying the tragedy of it, the Bible does give us answers to it that we can either accept or reject. And death and suffering is a consequence of sin, of Adam's sin. But so there were these factors, these philosophical factors, that he rejected Christianity, and therefore he had to, as a scientist, come up with another account of how we got here. And he was strongly assisted and encouraged by Charles Lyell. So Charles Lyell removed geology and time from Moses, and Darwin wanted to remove biology, the origin of life, from Moses, from a supernatural creation. And there were many, many other characters deeply influential, where undoubtedly philosophical things were at play. And that's not science. You know, for Lyell to say that he wants to remove geology from Moses, that's not a scientific statement. It's a belief statement. It's a rejection of one belief system for another belief system that he preferred. And so very much so there was that motive, and continues to be that motive today, that Richard Lewontin quote. It's not that our science compels us to reject the supernatural, but we've already decided that this is our rule for doing science. There may not be a supernatural component. Everything has to be explained by materialism, by material causes. And if the supernatural is the only explanation for something, then those material causes become more and more and more implausible and impossible, and sound like fairy stories, which is what Richard Lewontin effectively is admitting there, that some of our stories that we come up with are just ludicrous and counterintuitive and just so stories. But we have to do that. And in academia today, to go against that, there are huge, huge implications. And there's, you know, a lot of there's books out there that reveal what happens if a scientist today in academia, in the universities, dares to question that paradigm of materialism. And that's why those 30 or 40 scientists that sent that letter to New Scientist Journal, why they did it as a gang. Because to do that as an individual, you're in big trouble. To do it as 30 or 40 individuals, highly credentialed scientists, you've got a little bit more ammunition. They're not gonna fire 30 or 40 scientists or lose tenure in their universities or whatever. But there's a massive, massive price today for going against that orthodoxy of naturalism, philosophical naturalism.
Thanks, Mark. That's a brilliant answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think the Bible calls it doctrines of demons.
Yeah, and it's interestingly, there is even Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, wrote a book called Zoonomia decades before Darwin published Origin of Species, and it's basically a book of evolution. You know, we often think that Charles Darwin was the originator, but others were writing on these ideas long before Charles Darwin. All that Darwin did was come up with a plausible sounding explanation for how evolution could have worked, and that was natural selection. He believed that natural selection was the engine of evolution. Even evolutionists don't believe that today, but that's another, it's a subject on its own. And my point is that Erasmus Darwin was into very strange occultic things. When Darwin was writing his book, Origin of Species, on the origin of species, and developing his idea of natural selection, there was a guy, A.R. Wallace, who was a naturalist, and he was also into the occult and into strange things. And he had a fever he was doing research in, I think in Southeast Asia somewhere. And he had a fever, jungle fever, and dreams and hallucinations and things during that fever. And the idea of natural selection came to him in that condition. And he wrote a letter which he addressed, I think he actually, I can't remember the history, but he might have addressed it to Charles Darwin or one of Darwin's friends. And it came to Darwin's attention, and this was alarming to Darwin. So here was somebody in the jungle in Southeast Asia who had basically written on these ideas of natural selection and how natural selection would lead to evolution. And Darwin had spent decades. Darwin was an incredible procrastinator. And he spent decades coming up with his book and writing these ideas and things. And he had been pipped to the post, as it were, by this letter. And so they very quickly arranged a presentation to the Royal Society, Scientific Society.
Royal Geographical Society, maybe.
Well, yeah, Royal Scientific Society. I can't remember the actual name. And they arranged for Darwin to present his paper on natural selection first, and then they read A.R. Wallace's paper, because they were alarmed at the idea of A.R. Wallace being the first to, pipping Darwin to the post. So, and as I say, A.R. Wallace was into the occult and so on, and this came to him in hallucination, and it's all out there, it's all documented. This isn't some kind of conspiracy theory anymore. Your modern evolutionists recognize how this was all manipulated, and so there is a direct connection with the occult and a belief in evolution, or the system of evolution.
Yeah.
Although Darwin himself, there's no evidence that he had any of those influences, direct influences in his life.
The very fact that the first 4 books of the Bible were written by 4 different men from their point of view, but they're relating what they saw from their point of view, but there's an absolute connection between the 4 books. There's no contradictions. There's a little bit extra in this one and a little bit extra and slightly more in the other one. This one doesn't express it exactly the same way, but there's absolutely no contradiction whatsoever. So man sees things differently, but when there's that absolute fitting together of the same story, you can't say that these people were lying, and that it's not true.
Yeah, but
Those
that idea
first 4 books knit together so beautifully.
Yeah, they do. But Cedric, even that idea that they were written by 4 different authors comes from German higher criticism in the 19th century. Jesus believed that Pentateuch was written by Moses. There is quite a lot of evidence that Moses had writings handed down to him that assisted him in compiling that history and so on, that formed the Pentateuch. But the idea that it was written by 4 different authors comes from the same idea as the Kenosin idea, that the Bible is just a work of man. It's not it doesn't have a supernatural element. and
Yes.
and it's higher criticism. So, but as you say, there's just a wonderful harmony throughout, not only the first books of the Bible, but throughout the Bible, of building upon himself. Somebody has said that the Bible is not the type of book that man would write if he could, and it's not the type of book that man could write even if he wanted to. So that God is the overall author of the scriptures is very, very clear.
Yes.
It is a remarkable, inspired book. Okay, let's take some time to pray. Good to be with you. Let's hope our young men catch up with the recording, and let's take some time to pray.